Hello, good morning, Annyeonghaseyo. It is a real delight and honor to be here. And I must open by thanking my host this week, as I've been doing a week of research on Korea, and Seoul in particular, but also Busan, to the Institute for Global Economics, who have been superb hosts for me today. Second, I would like to thank Yongwon and the corporation for their support, because as you gather, the title today is very much about connectivity and cities, and anything in today's climate that brings people together and connects them, in my opinion, almost always has to be a good thing. And please don't blame me for connecting you with the London climate. I think that's a bit of a stretch too far. Well, I was asked to talk about connectivity in cities and how to build successful technology and financial centers. And so I thought I would just pile into it with a fair amount of research that we've been doing. I'll touch towards the end on what it's been like to be Lord Mayor last year, things that I've learned. But I am, at heart, a researcher and a scientist. Now, we in the Zien Group looked at the issues to do with city development back in the late 1990s. And the reason that we were looking was, you recall that London and the UK were not joining the euro. And the fear at that time was that we would suffer greatly. A research report was done called Sizing Up the City, published in 2002. And it looked at all the competitors that London faced at that time. New York, Paris, Frankfurt, I just named them all. It was a terrible report. It had nothing to do with anything that I understood, even at that time, in the early 2000s. Where was Tokyo? Where was Dubai? Where was Hong Kong, Singapore, etc.? So we began with the three studies that you see at the bottom, with the one on the left, the Global Financial Centers Index. And last week, we published our 37th edition. 37th edition. So on today's agenda, I just want to explore a little bit about what do we mean by commercial centers, which is wider than financial centers. Why do networks and connectivity matter? How do we go about measuring them, with some thoughts about Seoul's positioning and some concluding thoughts on how to build a successful center. So successful centers are all about interaction. The great economist Jane Jacobs, who led some of the great studies on cities, pointed out that cities are effectively places co-created by people. And the biggest connector is that we are meeting other people. And anything that facilitates that tends to be helpful. We can think of that in terms of air travel, concerts, we can think of it in terms of logistics, we can think of the maritime sector. Cities are places where people join together. And they really bring together three groups of people. Typically, they bring investors. They also bring traders. All that connectivity leads to trade. And they bring what I often call, in a wide sense, guarantors. Accountants, credit rating agencies, lawyers, people who basically say that the system works. And beneath all of that, then there's a host of other things. I'd start particularly, honestly, with regulators, but we move through consultants, actuaries, scientists, engineers, etc. So commercial centers are really just clusters of expertise where people do want to meet each other. And what's the vision for such centers? Well, we in London have been working from the bottom up on creating interaction. We believe in a phrase that in English is called serendipity. It's the chance meeting or encounter with people that leads to exciting and interesting things. In the City of London, I've been part of a group, or leading the group actually, on what we call groundage, which is taking back the ground of the city and allowing people to wander through more freely. This is a program that we began planning some 15 years ago, and you're starting to see the benefits now. For those of you who've been to London, you may realize you can walk through the Bloomberg Centre, but only 8 years ago you could not. That entire area was blocked off to pedestrians. 22 Bishopsgate, 100 Bishopsgate, etc. We're trying to increase the serendipity. Equally, we have a program called Roofage, which is where we're trying to open up the roofs across the city. We now have something like 8 places where people can congregate up on high for free and actually come and look. So there's a lot of little things add up to a heck of a lot. But the other thing about commercial centers is we're seeing that cities are not based on single industries anymore. It used to be you had a mine, you had a mining city. You had a city that was based around power and water or something like that. The city was typically based around a single thing. Today, most cities effectively share very much the same vision. You could list this and give this template here to just about any mayor of any town. We want to be inclusive, we want to be smart, we want to be innovative, we want to be digital, we want to be green, we want to offer great quality of life, and we want to be resilient and robust. In fact, it's becoming harder and harder to differentiate cities from each other. They tend to be based now around science and technology, economics and finance, and typically logistics. Those are a commonality. One can see this, particularly if you look at mainland China over the last 30 years. You've got almost an identikit of various cities in most places. So, my theme last year was called Connect to Prosper. I was trying to emphasize the importance of connectivity to people. And I was talking about, we were trying to celebrate the many knowledge miles that flowed through the City of London and out around the world, connecting us with places such as Seoul or Busan. And I used the analogy of a coffee house. You may think today a tea house, and that will do, but a coffee house. When you go to a coffee house, you would sit in the olden days, in the mid-1600s when they began, and they were called penny universities. You could learn from anyone. In fact, there's a term in English called spend a penny, which means to go to the toilet. But actually, that euphemism didn't apply here. Spend a penny in those days meant you could spend a penny and drink coffee all day and listen to everyone and be treated as an equal. And it was those coffee houses and networks of connections that meant people would sit in a coffee house and agree to trade stocks, Jonathan's, agreed to do insurance, that was Lloyd's, agreed to trade ships, that was the Baltic. They all sprang from coffee houses. The Baltic from the Baltic Coffee House. So networks, when you look at them, are an interesting area of study for scientists, but they really show you how complicated life can be. Networks matter because, in fact, they are the foundation of all structured nodal connections. Life itself is based around a nodal structure of networks. AI, which seems to be on everybody's lips today, is just a set of network connections in a neural network. But what we see is you can get quite metaphysical about networks. So you've got, for example, when you design networks, people talk about how complex they are. Separations aren't crisp and clear. Take a map. A map is very ambiguous, and yet it's full of all of these connections. When you look at a city, is it defined by its defensive walls? In London, we make quite a bit of our medieval walls. Is it about planning permission? Is it taxation? Is it where workers are located? Is it where residents are located? Is it dependence on a host of infrastructure, air, water, sea transportation? Is it the waste system? So you begin to see that it's not simple. When you study cities, you'll find that just something as basic as what is the population of the city is a very complicated question. The City of London is extremely complicated. I would argue we are one of the most connected cities in the world in all sorts of ways. But what many people forget is that the City of London has 8,000 residents in 1 square mile, about 2.2 square kilometers, and 687,000 workers. So 687,000 people commute. It's also why we were hurt so badly by COVID. Without that commuting, we suffer greatly. But when that commuting is functioning, we are more intense than Manhattan, which spreads about 350,000 people across 6 square miles. We're much more intense in an odd way than Tokyo. Tokyo does actually move more people around, but they don't go to a single center. So when you're in the City of London, you know for a fact that nobody is there to walk the dog. They're not there for a pint of milk. They're there to work and do business. And it leads to a very different culture, one of hyper-punctuality, because time is money, It means that I can be standing in a pub and a young fellow of 25 without any problem whatsoever will nudge me and say, while we're waiting, what do you do for a living? It's perfectly normal because everybody is there to do work, and it changes the culture that we have. So when we look at these cities, you begin to realize that the network analysis both matters, but it is also frighteningly weak. Science can do things like invert networks. All the nodes can become connections, and all the connections can become nodes or links. So you begin to see that it's a useful tool for modeling, but in truth, it isn't sufficient. And we do have to rely quite a bit on art and guile in terms of figuring out how we are going to do this type of analysis. So one of the things you'll hear from a lot of scientists about networks are their emergent properties. Now, emergent property is really a pompous name for surprise. Networks do surprising things that you don't expect. Who would have thought that a bunch of neurons connected by synapses would become conscious? So you begin to realize that networks do interesting things. And it's from these networks that we see unexpected order, responsiveness, reproduction, growth, regulation, evolution, homeostasis. These are all things that scientists study when they look at networks. But it's the complexity that emerges that's important. Belasuki argues that biological complexity as we see it today cannot have evolved without networks. So they are there, and they have an ability to shock us with the things that they can surprisingly do, and they also have an ability to adapt to shocks. So how did we go about analyzing these complex networks? Well, the first thing that we began to look at was, in fact, the concept of connectivity. And this is a chart showing you people rating other centers and how you can begin to analyze where people are doing business. When we looked at London, which is where we started in the 1990s, this is sort of London's local network, looked at from a point of view wider than finance. What you see here is a chart showing 40 learned societies in blue, 70 universities in red, and 130 research institutes, all within 2 miles of the Guildhall. So this isn't London as a whole, this is just the city. Again, often overlooked, that complete intensity. Our city is about 35 to 40% financial and professional services, about 35% science and research. Many people forget we were the home of the Royal Society of Science in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. But we are also a media, culture, and education establishment. So it's this rich complexity here that becomes very difficult to analyze. People say London is a financial center. It is, but it is also many other things. So we began looking at factor assessment indices. This is a more common approach, but I believe we were amongst or the pioneer of this approach, which is to figure out how can we take perceptions that people have and mix them with actual facts to come up with a predictive method of assessing the status of centers. We take approximately 5,000 respondents every 6 months. We ask them to rate 130 cities, and we correlate that with about 130 instrumental factors. And we use this to predict what people would rate cities that they don't know about. I've taken the test myself. You go in and you rate a variety of cities. In my case, I hold 1 or 2 back, and I have the rating. And you would call it AI today. The technique is actually support vector machines, but this machine learning technique can predict quite accurately how you would rate a city you've never been to, based on what your propensities are for insurance. You like insurance, that's where you work. You also like to go jogging, and you like parks. You have a young family, and you want to have good education. And it will take these 130 factors and produce an assessment. So, where do we stand? Well, our world in the GFCI looks like this. When we began publishing in 2005, 6, and 7, we began with 46 centers. And today, as I said, we're tracking well over 140. And people often think that's because we're lowering the standard. In fact, that's not really true. What's happening is that we're seeing a proliferation of financial centers, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But you're probably interested in where Seoul stands. And the results last week were looking very much at the top 20. And as the mayor said, and as others have noted, Seoul has been doing extremely well. But Seoul wasn't even on this chart 20 years ago. So it is tremendous progress. And I would ask you all to take your hands out, clap yourself on the back. It's a great job. But I'm conscious here in Korea, you're not used to being just in the top 10. You'd like to be in the top 1 or 2 or even 3, as you are in so many other industries. So I do agree with the mayor, you can go a lot farther, but it will probably need some radical changes. You're hitting kind of the top end of what you can achieve. I might also point to Busan. We don't just analyze it. Busan is running at number 25, but it would make the slide unreadable. But I would point out that it was only 10 years ago that Busan was at number 51. So great changes are possible when you put your mind to it. But let's have a look at a couple of other things. What are the long-term trends? Well, one of the biggest long-term trends has been Asia over time. Again, when we launched the indices, people said there is no way whatsoever that Seoul, Beijing, or Shanghai are ever going to be financial centers. That's only 20 years ago. In fact, frankly, it was probably only 10 years ago. I've also been criticized for having far too many Asians completing our surveys. Over 50% of the respondents are Asia, to which I point out that at the moment, approximately 60% of finance is actually located in Asia. So we, Xi'an, still have work to do to increase the number of respondents to reach that. The second thing, of course, is that you shouldn't really rely on a single number. And the further down the league table you are, the more important it is to look at the richness of it. And we have a technique to rank cities against their competitive profile. And we look here, as you can see, at effectively 12 different types of ranking as to whether or not they're international, regional, global. Again, Seoul does extremely well here, but in the early days, Seoul was seen to be very much just a regional center, and it has now been growing. Another thing we look at is we break down into various sectors, and I would encourage you, if you're really trying to analyze a center, it doesn't help to say you're number 10, just as it doesn't help to say that your football team, wins 47% of the time. You've got to look at what are each player doing, how's the team working together, have you been practicing the plays that you run? You've got to be good at a variety of things. And we see here, across a variety of sectors, the way in which some of the leading players are placed. And you'll see highlighted in blue where Seoul is. And Seoul wouldn't be at number 10 if it wasn't doing well in many sectors. And that's going to become more and more important. It's sometimes what I call the Anna Karenina principle. In Tolstoy's novel, Anna Karenina, it opens with every happy family is alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. What he means is that when a family is happy, it's difficult to figure out why. The parents seem to have a similar attitude towards discipline, towards money, towards meal times, whatever. But when a family is unhappy, you know why. The father is a drunk. The mother is lazy and doesn't. So when you become happy, you have to be successful in many different categories at once, and they begin to reinforce one another. The second thing another thing that we are looking at, which is very interesting, is of course fintech. Again, Seoul does very well, and I believe this could be core to your competitive advantage, is the skills that you have here throughout Korea and in Seoul and Busan in IT. However, I like to point out to people, particularly as a technologist myself, who came into finance in the early 80s to put computers in. This is not new. Fintech is not new. It's what I've been doing my whole life, digitizing finance. But what I think we've achieved in finance is we are pretty highly digitized, And that's had huge effects on the structures of our banks and insurance companies who've moved to being automated. But we are not actually very well integrated with the real economy. You remember that 17 years ago, during the financial crisis, there were complaints that finance wasn't really supporting the real economy. And yet I look around in areas like shipping and aviation, and when it comes to finance, these great systems, which themselves have automation problems, suddenly hit a wall where they now have to go and issue an invoice and then get the invoice paid. It is not a seamless transition. And I would like to see finance become much more API finance, people buying in these services when they need them, us actually achieving something we've been talking about for over 40 years, which is microfinance, the ability to do very tiny payments successfully, letters of credit, credit lines, etc. There's a long, long way to go to integrate with the genuine real economy, which we have not succeeded in. One of the things that we've done in London is to launch two and a half years ago, a Smart Economies Network program, where we're looking at digital verification of people and their companies globally, combining that with the Nordic system X-Road, which is being used by their governments, and we're looking at applying that to trade. We've published 4 reports on what can be done, including one last week on digital verification, and we're hoping to start trials. We also, of course, have competitiveness factor groups, and again, you can see Seoul doing quite well here across the board. What is particularly satisfying is the strength of your regulatory system. It is seen globally to be quite a good regulatory system, and I think that gives you hope. Now, I'm going to touch very quickly in the time available on another item, which is, are you stable or dynamic? Well, we rate here each of the cities by the volatility and the volatility of the rating and the volatility of their factors. How much can they affect things? Well, one of the things you don't want to be is unstable, which is in the top right. But believe it or not, stable in the bottom left isn't a good thing either. It means you've got little ability to maneuver. And I think Seoul is ideally placed here as a city that has the opportunity to change the factors and make a material difference, and is not stayed. But just to turn briefly to point out that it's not just all about finance. We equally run the Smart Centers Index, looking similarly, but this time at about 77 centers. Again, when we look at the Asia top 15, we can see that Korea and Seoul are very, very well placed. We also have another index which looks at green. I must say, in my research this week, this is possibly one area where I think the Korea may need to look at biting the bullet. What are you actually doing about carbon trading? What are you actually doing about reducing emissions in general? And this is tough. You've got a lot of heavy industry, and this change is not going to be easy. I know you've made some steps towards it, but it does appear to me that you are a little bit weak in this area. So in the GGFI world, we're looking at 97 different centers and how green they are. You can see that in Asia Pacific, Seoul is looking quite good, but globally it needs to do better. And when you look at where the world is going in green, and that's probably even with Mr. Trump's machinations, we do have to solve the problem. And we are seeing a huge confluence between success as a financial and as a scientific center with green. This isn't actually that surprising. Cosmopolitan people want to work in centers that are seen to be green and responsible. So I'm not surprised at that at all. And we're also seeing some interesting heavy commitments. I would point you to the issuance of sovereign sustainability linked bonds in Chile, in Uruguay, and Thailand. These are bonds that actually bond cuff. They tie the hands together of the government. The interest rate goes up on these bonds if they do not meet their green targets. This to me is very exciting as a way of ensuring that government policy, which can change day to day, comes a little bit closer to meeting the needs of investors who, in areas of renewables, need to make 25-year commitments. And we're starting to see moves in that regard. One thing our index allows us to examine is whether or not the centers are accurately rated. We can actually put a center in and not put the name on it. And what's exciting here is on a 1,000-point scale, Seoul does quite well on the global financial centers. The marketing is in line with where it fits. By the way, in the case of Busan, it's a -7, which again means it's very, very close to where it should be. However, when it comes to the Smart Centers Index, you're 165 points down on the Reputation Index. There's a tremendous role for marketing Seoul as an IT center with finance. A lot more marketing needed. And then when it comes to green, as I said earlier, you're overrated by 49 points. And in fact, you need to do more action. You're overselling. A lot of people look at regulation as the way to achieve a financial center. And as I said at the beginning, regulation is very, very important. But regulation is a U-curve. I'm conscious I'm speaking to many people here who have far more experience than I in being a regulator. But it is very much a U-curve. You can have too much and you can have too little. We've seen this struggle in areas like digital assets. I think we're going to see it in AI. AI regulation is coming, and we've had a program over the last 2 years in the City of London to ask the financial services industry worldwide to use ISO 42001 as the regulatory approach to artificial intelligence. Because if we can get a single passport of certification, as we do in finance in areas like ISO 20022 for international payments, or as we do in ISO 27000, 65000 on risk and security, these are areas where we can get a single passport rather than having a plethora of competing regulations, which means that to export any of your services, you would find yourself in a position of having to get, in fact, at the moment, over half of the American states require you to meet specific AI regulation just for insurance. Then you hit the EU, etc. So I was pleased this week to find that the regulatory approach here in South Korea has been very much to be a little bit relaxed about AI. I think that's the proper approach. But there are market-based solutions through the International Standards Organization that would allow us as an industry to not have trade barriers be the result of AI regulation. So as I move towards closing, a few things, if I may. There are a whole host of emerging digital opportunities, but most centers in the world could do all of those. As I said earlier, it's becoming harder to differentiate commercial centers. It's becoming harder to differentiate financial centers. But I was just traveling through China last week on similar research. And one of the great things about the Chinese is everything has to be about numbers. So I will close with 4 lessons, 7 wishes, and 1 fundamental strategy, if I may. Well, what are the 4 lessons? Well, when you're head of the world's oldest democratic workers and residents cooperative, which is what the City of London is, workers have had the votes since about 640 AD, so we're nearly 1,400 years old. You get a very different aspect to life. You really do look to the long term. And I think that we learned 4 lessons over the years. And as I've read my history, I think I can substantiate this quite well. The first one is defense. That is definitely one of the big lessons. And we in the West have often forgotten that. It's become more apparent with Ukraine. I'm conscious that here you've never forgotten that. And it's important when it comes to areas like what are you doing on capital controls. So these are very, very real and important issues. Nobody brings their money to a war zone. It is a pretty basic fact of life. But once you have that, you move on. And I think what was interesting was Chairman Jun and Chairman Chong talking about what I would call the rule of law. But the rule of law is a very wide concept. It is not about litigation. It is, yes, about fair courts, equal treatment before the law. But it's also about the entire culture of the venue. Does the venue build trust? Can I trust people to do things? Because I don't want to go to the courts. It should be the courts are the backstop. What can I do in arbitration, mediation, conciliation, expert determination? These are all things that we understand in financial services, but sometimes we forget the rule of law is very important. I'm conscious you're going through some challenges at the moment. We too have been through similar challenges. With Boris Johnson, we had the prorogation of Parliament. We had our judges being attacked and insulted. We see what's been going on in America at the moment. But you play with that at your peril, because the rule of law is fundamental to everything that we do. After that, you go all serious economics and you support open trade. And then, of course, we need access to skills and talent. So those would be the 4 lessons. As far as the 7 wishes, well, I've already, my apologies. As far as the 7 wishes, I've already shown you those. And it's very much, that's what you'd like to do, and they're all things that you can follow. But I think the biggest thing here is never to forget about that connectivity diagram. And in this diagram, the core element here is soul. And you can see how well you're doing. But if you want to succeed, I wouldn't be measuring ourselves on number 10, moving to 9, 8, whatever your goal is. I would say that if you measure your connectivity, the results in the GFCI and the Smart Centers Index will prove themselves. So, where do we end? Well, as we move to one fundamental strategy, I would just point out that connectivity is everything. You have to be connected to be a commercial center. You can't be an international commercial center without international people. And you've made great strides in being welcoming to overseas people. I remember coming here when the signs were not in English. There are many things that you've done to achieve that. Successful people do want to live in successful cosmopolitan cities. When I was explaining here at breakfast and in other meetings, do not underestimate the impact that K-culture has had around the world. K-pop, K-drama. There are people who would have never heard of Korea who now have it beamed by Netflix into their sitting rooms, and they're watching it and absorbing Korean culture. Korean court dramas are a big thing abroad and show that you respect the rule of law in a way that Westerners understand. So there's a lot happening there. And reputation is vital. You can lose a good one just overnight. So what is the one fundamental strategy for success? Well, in truth, it's a very, very simple one. Treat all commerce fairly. That is it. You open up your center and you're well defended. The rule of law means that it doesn't matter who you are, you will be treated fairly as you come in, that you welcome everyone. You will have a successful financial center. There are subtleties to this. It goes well beyond telling your regulators to be fair on it. Take, for example, something as simple as competition regulation. One of our weakest areas in the United Kingdom is our retail banking. We have one of the worst retail banking systems in the world, which is surprising because we have, in my opinion, perhaps the finest wholesale finance in the world. But 3 banks control over 70% of the industry. 4 banks control, I think, 82%. That's not very competitive. And is that a market that you want to enter as a foreign retail bank? No. Do you have any problems? So what you want to see is a whole variety. So you don't want one giant pension fund, you want to see competition. If I enter a market where there's one giant pension fund, as a foreign entity, and I begin to have a problem, we know who's going to win, and it's not me, so I stay out of those waters. And just as a point of fact, the City of London, that 1 square mile, has 24,000 businesses, 40% of FX trading, 95% of protection and indemnity mutual insurance. I could go on and on. I was the Lord Mayor, so that's what I was selling. But the truth is, of those 24,000 businesses, 23,750 are small and medium-sized enterprises. We only have 250 organizations, over 500 people. That's all these small businesses that control that huge wholesale market, which is often missed because the signs are there, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan. That's not the real business. The real business in the wholesale markets is actually in the SMEs. And those 687,000 workers are up since Brexit. Brexit was in 2016. At that time, we had 525,000 workers. Why do we know so clearly? Because they have the vote. And we did our next vote audit just in November, and it was 687,000. And for those of you who are cynical, they're not all working in compliance. Of that, we've grown, global assets under management have grown from 11% to 13% over that same 8-year period. So we are very, very competitive. because people believe they will be treated fairly in London. And I might argue that I was not pro-Brexit and still not, but that our disappearance from Europe has led people feel they might not be treated quite as fairly in Frankfurt or Paris, and they might as well base their European operations in London. So we're doing fine at that level. The UK as a nation is a more complex beast. But the one fundamental strategy for success is to show that you really will treat all comers fairly, and indicators like the number of businesses and sectors rather than one giant behemoth. The indicators of the variety in this sector are all signs of good health, as you would expect from network theory. So if I may, I'd like to thank you very, very much for listening to me this morning. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out so bright and early. I'm staying in the hotel, and even I found it a little early. So I appreciate you coming, and I thank, again, my hosts this week, the Institute for Global Economics, for doing such a great job at helping me research. And I would like to thank Young One as well for sponsoring this connectivity. Thank you. Very happy to take questions or comments or observations.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mainelli, for your illuminating presentation. But continuing with our long tradition to have our floor engaged in our dialogue. So allow me to invite a question or two from the floor. Okay, Ambassador An, for you. Korea's ambassador to the United States before. Yeah.
Well, as a matter of fact, before that, ambassador to the European Union as well. Well, Lord Mayor, such a pleasure and honor. And when I come to this IG get-togethers, I would tell myself, I'm coming for intellectual peace. And then today, I was listening to you, and I said to myself, this is intellectual peace by excellence. So thank you so much. So having said that, one comment and then one question. My comment is, in relationship with what Prime Minister Jong Chen said, his conversation with one of his colleagues while in London, and then he said, London became London because of trust. And I was listening to you, and I said to myself, well, what do I get from the Lord Mayor? It seems to be that London became London because of connectivity. That in fact is something like that. That's my comment. My question is, with respect to your last slide, which is treat all comers equally, and all comers equally. And I said to myself, what is the equivalent expression in terms of international trade? There is MFN, most favored nation. Think about what Mr. Trump is doing in the United States, where he in fact is decimating the principle of MFN. And then what I think is this, which is that, well, it is not only trade, it is the whole system of rule of law that he is demolishing. And then, this is a closed session I heard, so I was wondering if I could get a very frank view on what the impact of Mr. Trump's actions will be on the rule of law. Thank you.
All right. From finance to trade. Now we'll find out why Mr. Trump is losing trust. Okay.
Well, firstly, Your Excellency, thank you for your kind remarks. I was actually, my guild, we have guilds in London, and I was master of the Worshipful Company of World Traders. And we've done quite a bit of research on trade as well, in particular where trade flows work. Tariffs, wow. Tariffs are an interesting problem. In 1973, Britain decided to join the EU. And if you talk to Australians or New Zealanders, as far as they're concerned, we kicked them in the teeth. They were exporting lamb to Britain, and we said, we can't take your lamb any longer. Now we're in the EU, tough on you. Now, I happened to have met the Australian High Commissioner at that time, and interestingly, his son was High Commissioner at the time of Brexit. An interesting bit of nepotism, perhaps. But in truth, he pointed out that we Australians got going. And I said, what do you mean? He said, we just went to people and we said, we'd love all of your cheap subsidized trade goods. Please, keep sending them to us. We don't mind. By the way, if you'd like to buy any of our stuff, that's fine. And as you'll be aware, Australia signed more free trade agreements than any nation on earth. And it did it with a department of less than 350 people. And that's because they really took free trade seriously. Now, I know that they're not perfect. I have. Nobody is. But I look at this, and those of us in the West, I think, face a couple of issues. If Mr. Trump is so wrong about tariffs, and I believe that intellectually, and I believe it in the sense of not treating others fairly, then shouldn't we look at this as a giant global experiment? And those of us who are not, going far harder towards free trade. So, I think some of the challenges facing us are going to be, what do we do with the comprehensive, CPTPP, I always get that wrong, comprehensive and progressive treaty. So what if we all decide to move towards free trade assertively and aggressively, to really drop it? What if here in Seoul, in services, particularly in accounting, legal, actuarial, you start dropping some of those, making yourselves even more international, even more open? I think that would be the best way to prove Mr. Trump wrong, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Now, next, Ambassador Hwang Kyung-wook, former Whereas ambassador to OECD. In our forum, ambassadors tend to be very active, rather than diplomatic.
Thank you very much for very informative and excellent presentations. Following, treat everybody fairly and following on this Mr. Trump, not on the tariff and trade side, but on the financial sector side. Now there's a talk about Minsk report. When they are talking Minsk report, who is the CA chair, I think, he's talking about Mar-a-Lago exchange rate accord following the Plaza accord, and he was also talking about introduction of perpetual treasury bond, and he sort of indicated all this tariff war is an instrument to reach there, this perpetual bond conversion as well as new exchange rate mechanism. What do you think about this likelihood and the potential impact of their discussions?
Well, Your Excellency, as you know, I'm delighted to see that you don't lose all that ambassadorial talent, which we sadly do, that we often retire them. And you've gained so much, and now you speak out freely. I've always been impressed at how ambassadors manage to stay calm and hold their tongue when I would be exploding. That's me. Well done, you. Yes, in terms of where we go in areas like exchange rates, we always have that classic trilemma. If you want to keep your currency together, if you want to have capital controls when you're doing about foreign entry, it's a really complex issue, as we know. And as has been argued many times, you can only have one of the three elements to the trilemma. I personally have always believed in free exchange rates. That's a personal thing, but I think intellectually, every time we've tried to control exchange rates, if you look at it, it goes wrong. So things like the Plaza Accord and things like that, I see as essential. I'm not saying they were wrong to do them, I'm just saying they have to always be seen as temporary. One of the things I'm quite excited about, however, if you look at the central bank digital currency arguments, so far, there have been very few arguments as to why we're really doing it. One could argue that the United States, once it guaranteed Silicon Valley Bank, already has a central bank digital currency. It's a government currency, it's just that your bank account's held privately, and the mess of stuff between Visa and MasterCard in your bank account is really terrible. You would never design it that way. But at the top level, it's a digital currency that you're handling, you can do everything digitally, and the central bank has guaranteed it. So what's your problem? It's kind of there. And I've been talking to the Reserve Bank of India. I have been to see Professor Hong Kong in China, and all the people who've done these experiments actually conclude we're not quite sure why we did it. Reserve Bank of India, the customers in the SMEs who are using it keep saying, we don't understand what you're trying to tell us. We can't see the difference. It's true. What is the difference to you? Interestingly, though, then people go and talk about programmable money. Well, programmable money has some problems as well. One is you'll be giving governments huge amounts of tax capability. A government could actually wake up and say, I think there are more votes in the regions in Korea, so I'm going to have a Seoul tax. And it works like this. If I'm out in Jeju, it's 0.01%. And as I get closer and closer to the center of Seoul, I get to the palace. At the palace, it's 99.99%. That's a crazy tax. Might get some votes. But a politician could actually create that tax in an afternoon with a central bank digital currency. So be careful of what you wish for. Second thing is, if it's programmable, it means we ruin liquidity, potentially. But the benefit for central bank digital currencies might be, to your question, our ability to form trade baskets of currencies that are dynamic. This has always been very, very difficult. We've never been able to form a trade currency for clusters like shipping, like oil and gas. You can actually say, I'm going to weight a basket of currencies and I'll let this be programmably updated so that I make a contract with you over 15 years to purchase your energy, and we base it on an energy coin, which is a basket of central bank currencies which adjusts based on, say, GDP. These are some of the exciting things that will come forward and will mean that my vision of trying to control exchange rates is slightly wrong. I see that as the way forward. Okay.
I think, okay, the last question. It's already 12 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Mainelli, for your very erudite presentation. I learned so much this morning. When you mentioned the strength of the city of London, you started out the first bullet, the rule of law, which brings to my question. The world is changing very rapidly, but along with it, it's also becoming very diverse. In comparison to that, the ability to govern all these diverse societies and bring it together is diminishing. United Nations basically is becoming powerless with the 5 nations of veto power, never agree on anything. And not only that, each nation, I think in my personal opinion, the leadership quality and the capability is diminishing, if anything, compared to the past. And how do you see we will in the future to bring together all these developing centers together, work in very peaceful cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you. It's very tough for me to be brief anyway, and especially with such a good question as that. Might I say, I think globally we are struggling with governance. I mean, the concept of having a vote as a democracy every 4 or 5 years has actually proven more divisive. One of the problems I had in the city was people would say, well, as Lord Mayor, you were elected by an overwhelming majority. And I said, so what's your opinion here? A good election is 50.1% won against 49.9%? Well, no, but you don't want to be like some dictator like Putin where you win 99%. I said, well, maybe there's nothing wrong with that. If society actually agrees on the direction forward, isn't that a good thing? Now, I accept 99% is sort of absurd, but a 65%, 70% election, what's wrong with that? In some ways, party politics has become divisive for us. But that's at the national level. And then we look at the local level, where all of this new technology that we have, we still haven't found ways to deploy it in governance systems. So if we look at the history of mankind extracting narrative from complex situations, we have the Greeks with debates, we have tribunals, we have court cases where people try and decide what should be done. The Romans had a major invention in about 200 BC, which was representative democracy. And then the next invention was, there wasn't one. So we've had 2,200 years. We haven't really rethought through how we do things except through some basics of voting. This is a tough area, but it's not being ignored. Very strangely, I had a conversation at length about this last year in Saudi Arabia, where they're trying to figure out how they can have bottom-up democracy and governance and yet retain a monarchy. I'm not saying that it's possible, but they're having those discussions. In the Nordic countries, there's a movement called liquid democracy, which tries to vote on policies and gives people transferable votes. So we go to a party meeting, and I'm an expert on green issues, and you're an expert on maritime trade, and you've got 40,000 votes, and I have 25,000, and we vote on the policy, but then that is transformed later into a vote onto whether or not to do it. So some things there. Brian Eno, the musician, has a thing, a situation which he's working with the UN on, called One World or None. Last year, they ran a global citizens assembly, 100 people randomly chosen. And it was an interesting assembly because of the 100 people, just to show you it, it's 50% of it. Can you believe that? 50% were women. I don't understand, but apparently that was the case. And they had to have 80 translators because it wasn't about being in English. So 180 people on it. You know, people don't speak English. It's a big world out there. But the point isn't to make fun of it. I think it's an exciting program. What I'm trying to point out is that people are struggling everywhere with how we do this bottom-up governance. And I guess if I had another life, I'd probably love to move into setting up an institute where we were looking at new governance structures and how they would work. There are lots of proposals out there, but we haven't really gone much further than the time of the Romans.
Okay, Orset, please join me in thanking Dr. Mainelli for his exceptional insights that he shared with us today. Thank you very much indeed. Okay.